Hey there, kids. It's Professor Frank again. We got ourselves a little bit different book here. Excuse me. This is Too Afraid to Cry, Maryland Civilians in the Antietam Campaign. Antietam Campaign is the first Confederate invasion of the North during the Civil War, and this book is by Kathleen A. Ernst. So, we're going to be talking about a little excerpt off page 126 in this book. I'll be reading it to you. And it talks about Henry and Elizabeth Piper. They're two civilians who lived in Sharpsburg at the time of, in 1862, at the time of this Confederate invasion of the North. And this chapter is particularly relevant and reveals a lot about the effect of the Civil War on civilians, especially, in this case, civilians who lived in Maryland or Sharpsburg during the Confederate invasion. So, without further ado, we'll get into it. Henry and Elizabeth Piper and their children lived on a prosperous farm north of Sharpsburg near the Hagerstown Turnpike, part of an old land grant known, ironically, as Mount Pleasant. Henry's fondness for fashionable headwear had earned them the local nickname Old Stovepipe. Although reputedly a Unionist, he also owned slaves, who lived in a stone building besides the well on their farm. When the Confederate Army appeared, most of Piper's fields were freshly plowed, ready for planting. They were going to plant winter wheat, but a 25-acre cornfield still needed to be harvested. Piper also owned a 15-acre apple orchard, which 15 acres is a lot. That's a lot of apples. That's crazy. This guy farmed a lot. So he had some help, though, apparently. So the beautiful farm was in the center of Lee's battle line on September 17th. And General James Longstreet and D.H. Hill commandeered the Piper farm home for their headquarters. Those two guys are Lee's top lieutenants that, command different wings or corps of his army. Soon the yard was busy with couriers and staff, and maps and swords littered the tidy farmhouse. That evening, the nervous Piper daughters served the general dinner, and in an attempt to be courteous, offered the men wine, which offering soldiers wine, probably not the best idea. Longstreet initially refused, but when he saw General Hill drink some without ill effect, he said, "Ladies, I will thank you for some of the wine," and went to work. After dinner, the generals urgently urged the family to leave. The Pipers quickly packed what they could carry into a wagon, and Elizabeth buried her dishes into the ash pile. As the family set out, one of the female slaves cried, "Oh my God, take me along." She made the trek, walking beside the wagon, carrying Henry and Elizabeth's 6-month-old grandson, Elmer, in her apron. "We left everything as it was on the farm," Mary Ellen recalled later, "taking only the horses with us and one carriage." So that's probably being big. If they have 15 acres of apples, that's a very small portion of what they, own as a whole. After leaving their home to the dubious protection of James Longstreet and D.H. Hill, Confederates again, the family headed towards Killiansburg Cave, but they ultimately decided to seek shelter at Henry's brother Samuel's farm near the Potomac. That's a river. Importantly, there's a battle looming, and they're also deciding, rather than going into a cave, which provides a lot of shelter, they're going onto a farm, which is as above ground and exposed as their farm back home. So, a group of Keysville women and children. Keysville is a nearby town to Antietam. It's a little ways to the northwest, including Oliver Riley, left their homes and made their way to Samuel Pry's mill. The Pry home proved to be nebulous haven, which means not very safe. While there, 7 Confederates asked Mrs. Pry for supper. You notice that's a habit. Invading armies are going to pretty much take all the food that they want. Let's see. She set their table on the porch, and as they were eating, all but one, in parentheses, who was sick and lying in the corn crib. Disease is also a common factor affecting soldiers during the war. A group of Union cavalry clattered down the road and ordered their surrender. When one refused, a Yankee pointed his revolver and called, "Come out or I will shoot you down." Remembered Oliver Riley, Mrs. Pry threw up her hands and cried, "For God's sake, don't kill him on the porch." The rebel reluctantly conceded defeat, and the lot of them trudged away under guard. So that took care of the rebels. They were captured. At McClellan's headquarters, the Philip and Elizabeth Pry family, including Samuel, 14, Alfred, 12, Ellen, 9, Jacob, 5, Charles, 3, and a year-old daughter, that's 6 children, which is a lot more than we have today on average, was still in residence. Elizabeth Pry was cooking breakfast for General McClellan and General Hooker, these are Union generals now, when an ambulance arrived, intended as transport for Hooker. Guess he got injured. Instead, McClellan ordered Elizabeth to take away her children to safety, and with the ambulance at their disposal, they trundled away to a friend's farm in Keedysville. So now they're getting substantially out of the way of the fighting. After the capture of Harper's Ferry, most of Jackson's Confederate men hustled back across the Potomac River to provide critical support to the outnumbered rebels already poised on the hills. A Georgia regiment, arriving in the morning of September 16th, halted in a peaceful grove just outside of a town of Sharpsburg, near a small plain sanctuary, the Dunker Church. Dunker Church plays a pretty big role in the upcoming fighting. Captain James Nisbet asked, "Who are the Dunkards?" A civilian explained, "They're German Baptists. This is a German settlement." Any quote-unquote Germans lingering near the lines that day were treated to a strange performance. As Harper's Ferry veterans greeted South Mountain veterans, those are 2 battles, basically, that preceded this, regimental bands struck up their beloved anthem, Dixie. That's the Southern Army's favorite song. And the rough, reverent chorus swelled. It was William Pogue who recalled that it was inspiring, soul-stirring music. That afternoon, Federal commanders were still jockeying their divisions into place. Several crossed the Antietam near Samuel Pry's grist mill. Most of the 1st Corps bivouacked on the Hoffenberger farm, that's another German farm, near the Hagerstown Turnpike. General McClellan ordered Jephthah Taylor of Keedysville to provide supper for himself and his staff officers, paying Taylor $2.50 in gold for his trouble. Note that the Union Army was fighting, I guess, more for Maryland, even though Maryland's a divided state at this time and contributes troops both north and south. Union Army will still commandeer food forcibly, but then they'll kind of give them a little, few shekels in exchange, so to speak. Around dusk, a fierce artillery barrage erupted, and civilians crouched in cellars, trembling with each deafening roar. About 9 o'clock, it began to rain. And Albert Richardson, correspondent for the Tribune, that's a newspaper, wandered into a farmhouse, occupied now only by some pickets. Those are the advanced guard of the Army. Pickets feel out the opposing force, and they make sure that no troops from the opposing army can sneak in to their army's lines. So anyway, where was I? Okay, using a saddle as a pillow, Richardson lay down on some farm wife's scoured parlor floor to get some sleep. Richardson was fortunate. The 12th Corps didn't bed down in the tidy cornfield of Martin Lyons Farm until midnight. Surgeons had already established a field hospital in the house itself. 12th Corps is a Union Army group. during the battle. They contained actually about 1/7 of the army. Fun fact. And a field hospital is a pretty gruesome place. It's where, for one thing, residences and farms and civilian buildings would be converted into field hospitals, and either army would take in their wounded from the battle and they would lay them out on, inside the newly founded field hospital and perform any necessary operations to save their life, up to and including amputation, which is when your limbs get cut off, because these big bullets they fired during the Civil War, they would smash into you, mushroom out. Psh, suddenly you didn't have any bone from here to there, so they had no choice but to take your arm off. The same thing would happen today, as a matter of fact. And these civilians who own this property, and some of whom are still lingering around, have to witness this. They have to see those amputations, or they at least have to hear what's going on, which is not pleasant at all. So, McClellan had ordered no fires and complete silence amongst the troops, and no one in any of these homes near the lines dared light candles or lanterns for fear of drawing fire. The dark blanket that settled over the tense valley was punctuated sporadically by bursts of gunfire as jumpy pickets fired at each other in threatening shadows. A big battle was coming, and no one got very much sleep. That's it. That's all for the book. Now, takeaways. If I had an audience, I would ask, what are the takeaways? And then I would wait. And since I asked that question and I have no audience, I'll go ahead and say the main takeaways are, looking at the lens of impact on civilians during the Maryland campaign. One is they're having their property and their services and their food constantly solicited and stolen by Union officers and Confederate officers alike, who, either don't pay them at all, pay them in worthless money if they're Confederate, because the Confederate script doesn't do any good in Northern territory, and or maybe they get like pennies on the dollar for what their services or property is actually worth from the Union Army. So they're also forced to leave their property. They don't know what's going on. They don't know if when they return their property is going to be there, or if it's going to be decimated either by foraging soldiers or by cannonballs and shrapnel and explosions. So you can imagine just like the sheer dread and fear and terror that these people are experiencing when their otherwise peaceful farming lives are totally uprooted. It's also interesting that you get a look into the sentiments of soldiers, right? and well, not so these civilians too, the political and moral sentiments, I suppose, of these people, because there's the family I was talking about, they owned slaves. They were also pro-unionist, and by that time the Emancipation Proclamation had not yet been declared. That would not happen until after the Battle of Antietam. So the war was not officially changed into a matter of slavery yet. It was still officially a war over Union versus state sovereignty, and slavery was, although the underlying cause, it wasn't acknowledged by really either side until the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Lincoln. But still, even though it's pretty obvious that the North is moving towards abolition of slavery, getting rid of slavery, and essentially a Northern victory would cause the freeing of slaves. This person who owns slaves is still a pro-unionist, and their slave requested to be brought with the owners and not left behind, because if they were left behind with the Confederates that had commandeered the property, then they would be likely kidnapped, taken, sold into slavery. Not for sure, Not every Confederate unit did this, but it was a risk. So it's telling that a slave would rather stay in, the possession of a Maryland, resident, rather than risk being taken and sold into the Deep South. So that makes you think. Yeah, but overall, just a very war in general, as it intersects with civilian lives, is very destructive. Can really just turn your entire livelihood upside down and around. Can endanger your life and your property and everything. So basically, war's bad. We shouldn't do it. It should serve as a warning towards the present day as to it being advisable to avoid war. Because it sucks. So, yeah, that's about it. That's our takeaway. That was our. That would be a group discussion rather than a monologue if I had an audience that wasn't, a nice painting and a wall. So, there you go.